In situations of armed conflict, children are at heightened risk of detention. And at any given time, we found for this study that there are thousands of children who are being detained in the context of armed conflict, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, other times for years, often without charge. As we conducted our research, we found that children are detained in armed conflict for a number of reasons. The first is because they are believed to be associated with armed groups. So in close to 20 conflicts around the world, children are being actively recruited as soldiers. They fight as combatants, they serve as cooks, porters, guards, spies, or in other support positions. And some of these children are forcibly recruited or coerced. Others join because of poverty, peer or family pressure, incentives provided by armed groups, or because they believe that it's their best chance of survival. Now, children who belong to armed groups, they may be captured during battle, apprehended during military operations, or they may end up surrendering to government forces. According to international standards, they should be turned over immediately for rehabilitation. But instead, many children are detained. And this is particularly true if they're associated with armed groups that are perceived to be terrorist or violent extremist groups, groups like ISIS or Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, or the Taliban. So for example, in Iraq, we estimate that in 2018 there were 1,500 children that were detained simply on suspicion of being part of ISIS. A second reason that children end up in detention is because of security sweeps. In many armed conflicts, government forces will conduct big security sweeps to arrest particularly men and boys that they believe to be part of an armed group. For example, in Nigeria, armed forces have conducted big sweeps of areas where Boko Haram is active, often arresting many men and boys, regardless of whether they actually have evidence of involvement. But there's just an expectation that because the men and boys are from this particular area, they must have some association with Boko Haram. We've seen that the same is true in Somalia, where soldiers will often conduct mass arrests of men and boys who they believe may be part of Al-Shabaab. In some cases, boys are arrested only because they are perceived to be of fighting age and therefore guilty by association. A third reason that children end up in detention is because of the perceived activities of their family members. So again, for example, in Nigeria, in 2016, there were over 1,000 children that were detained. And the vast majority were detained not because of any of their own activities, but because of suspected participation in Boko Haram by their parents. We've seen this in other conflicts as well. For example, in Iraq, thousands of children and women have been detained in camps because they are related to men who fought with ISIS. A fourth way that children end up in detention is because of their religion, their ethnicity, or their place of origin. For example, in Libya, the Libyan National Army arrested men and boys from the Maghreba tribe. And ISIS, of course, has abducted thousands of women and girls from the Yazidi tribe in northern Iraq and Syria, and subjected many of them to forced marriage and sexual violence. A fifth reason that children end up in detention is simply for punishment. So for example, armed groups or forces may detain children if they refuse to join and fight with them, or if their parents were believed to be fighting for the opposition. In Myanmar, there are boys who have been detained because they deserted from the National Armed Forces. We also found that in a number of countries, children are being detained as hostages. In countries including Libya, Myanmar, Syria, and Yemen, armed forces and groups have taken children as hostages and used them for prisoner exchanges, for ransom, for extortion, or as leverage in negotiations with the opposing forces. And then finally, we also see children who are detained for sexual abuse and exploitation. I mentioned earlier the example of ISIS abducting girls from the Yazidi for sexual abuse. In South Sudan, we've also seen abduction of children by this SPLA for sexual exploitation and for rape. In 2017, the United Nations documented nearly 5,000 cases of children who were detained in the context of armed conflict, most often because of perceived association with armed groups. We know that that is a low estimate because there are many children who are never counted or may be detained by armed groups and don't end up in official registries. The number, however, is alarming because it's 5 times the number that the UN recorded just 5 years earlier in 2012. And we've seen that the increase largely correlates to increasingly aggressive counterterrorism measures, where governments in particular are more likely to detain children who are part of or believed to be part of so-called terrorist groups. International law explicitly prohibits any recruitment of children by armed groups that are distinct from the state. These children are entitled to rehabilitation and reintegration into societies. Standards are clear that the primary violators here are the recruiters who recruit the children, not the children. The children are primarily victims. And yet, increasingly, governments are detaining and prosecuting children for their involvement in armed conflict. Children are often held in appalling conditions. They may be held in military barracks, military camps, often held with adults, frequently without access to adequate food, medical care, forget about education or social services. Alarmingly, we found that many of the children who are detained in the context of armed conflict are tortured, most often to coerce confessions about their involvement with armed groups. In Afghanistan, for example, the UN found that nearly half of the children who were detained for alleged association with the Taliban and other armed groups reported accounts of torture. Similarly, Human Rights Watch found in northern Iraq that many of the children who are detained for alleged ISIS involvement have also been tortured to coerce confessions. And in some cases, the interrogators don't care whether the children were actually involved with ISIS or not. One boy told us, "My confession says that I was with ISIS for 16 days, but actually I wasn't with ISIS at all. I said 16 days just to stop the torture." A few of the children that we've documented who've been detained in the context of armed conflict have any access to legal assistance. And we've seen also in the context of counterterrorism, governments are often adopting legislation allowing harsher and longer sentences for children convicted of national security offenses. So some children have been sentenced to up to 20 years or even life in prison. International standards are also clear that children should never be prosecuted or detained simply for their membership or their association with an armed group. Now, this is not to say that if a child has committed a violent criminal offense, they can't be prosecuted. But those prosecutions should be rare. And of course, they should only be conducted in conjunction with international juvenile justice standards, including detention as a last resort. We found that governments may believe that detaining children who are allegedly associated with armed groups may enhance their national security. But in fact, it may be just the opposite, because children who are unjustly detained or ill-treated during detention may easily feel only more alienated, more marginalized, and seek retaliation by later joining an armed group or engaging in violence. And detention, of course, only makes it harder and more difficult for them to reintegrate into society and to rebuild their lives. The study will recommend to states that they really abide by international standards and continue to regard children who have been involved in armed conflict primarily as victims, and to really ensure their rights to rehabilitation and reintegration into society. That's one of the most important principles here that needs to be maintained.